I'm Ari Rebord, and this is TRM Talks. I am Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. At TRM, we provide blockchain intelligence software to support law enforcement investigations and to help financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses mitigate financial crime risk within the emerging digital asset economy. Prior to joining TRM, I spent 15 years in the U.S. federal government, first as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and then as a Treasury Department official, where I worked to safeguard the financial system against terrorist financiers, weapons of mass destruction proliferators, drug kingpins, and other rogue actors. On TRM Talks, I sit down with business leaders, policymakers, investigators, and friends from across the crypto ecosystem who are working to build a safer financial system. Today, we're going to be talking to Geoff White, acclaimed journalist and author of Lazarus Heist, about his most recent book, Rinsed, From Cartels to Crypto, How the Tech Industry Washes Money for the World's Deadliest Crooks. But first, inside the lab, where I share data-driven insights from our blockchain intelligence team. This summer, we've seen a spate of ransomware attacks on a diverse set of businesses, from telecom to automotive. Ransomware attacks against CDK Global, a major provider of software solutions for auto dealers, and telecom giant AT&T. Reportedly, in both cases, ransom payments were made in cryptocurrency and were traced by TRM to known ransomware actors. Since the 2021 watershed attack on Colonial Pipeline, we have seen a global response to the ransomware epidemic, yet we have seen attacks continue. Because payments are made in cryptocurrencies, however, law enforcement using blockchain intelligence can track ransom payments and disrupt ransomware groups such as Lockbit. Over the last few years, we've seen a proliferation of something called ransomware as a service. Ransomware as a service significantly lowers the barriers to entry for malicious actors. Ransomware as a service is a business model used by cybercriminals that allows non-technical attackers to deploy ransomware attacks with minimal effort. In this model, experienced ransomware developers create the malicious software and offer it to affiliates. Think the fast food, the McDonald's model, but for cybercriminals. The affiliates then execute the attacks. In exchange, the developers receive a share of the ransom payments. Key features of ransomware as a service includes a user-friendly interface, profit sharing, support, and updates. A key feature is also darknet-enabled anonymity and accessibility. Examples of ransomware as a service platform include Revel, DarkSide, and Lockbit. So why are we seeing more attacks over the last few months? As we see more and more ransomware as a service, it simply becomes easier to execute these types of attacks, even against entities as large as CDK and AT&T. We're likely to see a combination of continued attacks, but also governments globally coming together, public-private partnerships, and law enforcement activity to stop and disrupt ransomware action. For much more on ransomware, check out our TRM's Insights page. Now let's sit down with Geoff White. Geoff, thank you so much for joining TRM Talks again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I have to start with like a bit of a crazy story, and I would love to kind of get your reaction to it. So, in the US, Rinsed releases on August 16th. Is that correct?
I thought 13th, but you might be right.
13th, somewhere in that range. But, I'm in the US and I needed to read this thing, and I went onto Amazon and I noticed that I couldn't get the hard copy until that 13th date. So I ended up clicking on a link that said paperback, and ended up with this copy here, which was really interesting to me because I didn't think this book would be out in paperback probably for another year or so, right? Depending on whatever the cycle or your publisher. So I'm a little nervous right now that I have a counterfeit copy of a book about money laundering, and thought, like, of all people, you'd be like super interested in like how this happened. It came from India, to be like full disclosure.
Really?
But like if you're looking at it, it's very legit. You look at the spine, it has the penguin. So maybe this is something that's going to come out in a year, or it's in a warehouse somewhere. Like, do you have any thoughts around this?
Yeah, sometimes the publishers are the ones who ask about this. And honestly, the publishing industry, for anybody who's worked with it or in it, this will come as no surprise. But yeah, they do make copies available in sort of a paperback form internationally, and particularly in markets like India, they'll make that available. But there will be an actual proper paperback new edition with probably a different cover. So you've got your hands on some contraband goods there, Ari. I don't know how you've done that.
That's so interesting. I was thinking I had, which was crazy. So I owe you, I think, about $25, and I'll make sure to get that to you. But yeah, no, I was thinking like the irony is so crazy that I ended up with a counterfeit copy of a book about money laundering.
Exactly.
It's probably crazy on so many levels. Anyway, it does seem like it is the actual book.
It is, yeah.
And I have read it, and it's really fantastic. And we're going to dig into that in a moment.
Thank you.
But would love to kick off, as we typically do on TRM Talks, just hearing a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I started out as a general journalist, and I'd worked for an internet company many years before. So whenever a tech story came up in the newsroom, I would be the one to say, I think we should do that. We can do that story. And gradually became a sort of technology journalist. And at the time, it was the sort of era of Steve Jobs product launches. Steve Jobs was still at the head of Apple and alive at that point. The problem was the stories were kind of light. They were kind of not particularly hard news. And what worried me about that was that, number one, I came into the job to do hard news. The idea was to break stories and to reveal things that were hidden. But secondly, if you're doing these lighter weight stories, they tend to be at the end of the program, at the bottom end of the running order. And so something juicy comes in at the top, you get pushed off the end. And so we kept getting pushed off the end. And so I decided, well, we need to do harder news stories. We need to actually start investigating things. So that's how I started down the kind of investigative track. And the brilliant thing about technology stories for an investigative journalist is there's almost always a trail. It's very hard not to leave some artifact or some trace on the internet. So for investigation, it was really, really useful. So that's how I started down the investigative journalism sort of route, as it were. Started getting interested in cybercrime because obviously that's hard news, people being affected, people losing their life savings, companies getting hacked. And I realized that was an area of interest, a zone of interest. So I started looking at that. Put out a book called crime.com, which was everything you ever wanted to know about cybercrime, or at least back when it was released in, I think, 2018. And one of the chapters of that book was about North Korea and the now famous Lazarus Group, and the Lazarus Heist podcast grew out of that. And then the subsequent book grew out of the podcast. So that's sort of how I've ended up covering this stuff. But I'm sure we'll get onto this. One of the interesting things about covering North Korea is the country's accused of stealing money to keep the regime afloat. Now, if you steal money, particularly if you're under sanctions, you have to find a way to launder that money. So that's what sort of led me to this current phase of looking at money laundering specifically.
That is such an interesting connection. Just going back a tiny bit, do you remember what it was? Like, what was that hard news story that you're like, I don't want to keep getting buried here. I'm going to go from an Apple release to this. Like, do you remember what that like hard story was that got you at the top of the show?
Yeah, absolutely. We were getting up the running order. I was starting to do, more and more decent, what I regard as decent hard news stories. And we discovered that, the contactless cards that you pay with.
Sure.
We discovered that if your phone has an NFC reader, you could download some software that would allow you to hold your phone against a card and to pull the details off the card, because the details were amazingly, and I think they maybe still are, broadcast in the clear. So that's your card number, expiry date, and name. You don't get the 3-digit number from the back. But of course, what we discovered was there's a whole bunch of sites, at the time, Amazon included, where you didn't need the 3-digit number. You could just make an order using the card. So we showed how anybody in a bar could loiter next to you, run their phone over your contactless payment card, steal your details, and then order goods on the internet. And that led to the program. And when you lead the program in TV news, if you're a TV news program and you lead, it's very difficult to drop you because all of the headlines are, cut and everything. So you're almost undroppable at that stage. That was the story that I was really proud of. We led the program, and I thought finally technology and tech security has arrived as a news subject.
It really is. And it affected regular people, which is like why it was such a powerful story. People saw this and they were like, I remember seeing this story. What part of your career that I don't know that is well covered is your career as a thespian. Tell me a little bit about the secret life of your mobile phone.
Yeah, well, we've been covering tech security for a while, and data security and privacy were a big part of that. It's interesting. The privacy world and the data security and information security world are sort of two sides of the same coin, but weirdly they're separate industries in a way. So privacy was a big part of what we did. And we wanted to show the data that was leaking from people's phones. There's a project I launched at Channel 4 News called Data Baby, which was, we created a fictional identity. And we showed the sort of data that was leaking out of people's phones, out of their internet usage, using this persona, this personality, which is called Rebecca Taylor. We showed sort of, lots of different aspects of the data leakage and privacy kind of scene. And we wanted to sort of take this on the road. I wanted to put it in front of an audience and explain to them how this worked. And so there's a program called Wireshark, which is a bit old now, but basically Wireshark is amazing. It sort of sits between your computer or your phone and the internet and shows you everything that's going back and forth between them in a sort of grid pattern. And then you can map where all of your data's going and you can look at the packets and stuff. It's really, really interesting software. And as soon as I came across it, I thought, this is fascinating. If we put this in front of an audience, they get it. Because you talk about personal data, it's not really personal. But if you have an audience of people, and we would set up a Wi-Fi network, and we would start basically hoovering up the audience's traffic and putting it on the screen and showing them using Wireshark, this is what your traffic looks like. This is where your data's going. And suddenly people are switched on because it's not somebody else's data. It's not something out there that's ethereal. It's their phone on that screen. And so we decided to take this on the road. So in the end, we ended up doing the Edinburgh Festival. We sold out. We sold out the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, which was quite an experience. Now, frustratingly, you can only do that a few hundred people at a time. But the impact that you have on those few hundred people who've been in the audience and been in the theatre when that happened, we really sparked off some interesting conversations with that. And it just put you in a whole different world. I think one of the interesting things about being a journalist, but about being a person generally, is trying to put yourself in different situations and trying to learn from them. So suddenly we're dealing with theatre people. We're meeting actors and directors and producers from the world of theatre, and just made me encounter a whole bunch of new people. It's really, really interesting.
It's so cool. I think you're extraordinary, and it really does speak to the storyteller, I think, that you are. And when you read a Lazarus Heist, it's really a story about people. And that's something that was one of my major takeaways, is like, hey, I mean, we talk all the time about North Korea stole $1 billion. They launder it through this mixer. This is what they're doing. But the reality is, like, there was a hacker behind that, and that person had a family. And, how were they indoctrinated, and how are they, threatened into this role? And like, I feel like you sort of piece that out, and you really do the same thing with Rinse, where each chapter is dedicated to a different story. But would love to kind of just, kick things off with your take on the book and maybe the process of writing it.
Yeah, it's interesting. So anybody who's heard the Lazarus Heist podcast or read the book will know this is about North Korea and the accusations of North Korea stealing money from banks and cryptocurrency companies, among others. And of course, whenever you steal money, if you've done it illegally, if you steal money, it's criminal money, or if you're North Korea and you're subject to sanctions, you have to hide the trail. And so one of the interesting things about Lazarus Heist, both the podcast and the book, is if you're paying attention, on the surface, it sounds like a cybersecurity, cybercrime story. But actually, about between a third and a half of the story at any one moment is about money laundering. It's about how they're moving the money around. And actually, that became, for me, one of the more interesting bits. And the sort of crazy cast of characters they ended up working with to do this. That there was the famous Instagram influencer Hush Puppy, who originally hailed from Nigeria but ended up in Dubai, who helped launder millions of dollars of money for North Korea. And his sort of accomplice, Big Boss, this guy, was born with a silver spoon in his mouth in Canada and ended up teaming up with Hush Puppy. And so these characters became really interesting. But more widely, the world of money laundering became interesting to me. And I sort of realized that unless you have the laundering, you can't do the crime. So going back to the Bangladesh bank example, the famous 2016 attempted theft of $1 billion, they broke into the bank in 2015 and they were there for a solid year. They had access for a solid year, which makes you wonder, well, why didn't they steal the money earlier? Why did they risk waiting around for a year? Well, the answer is laundering. It took them a year to line up the routes to escape the money. If they hadn't have got those routes, they wouldn't have been able to steal the money. And as I've looked at this, it's not just cyber criminals who rely on money launderers. It's all types of organized crime. They all make money. They all need to hide it and move it somewhere. So you've got this whole industry serving almost every type of organized crime. And without that industry, the crime doesn't happen. If we could get rid of money laundering, a lot of crime would be solved overnight.
Really well said. At TRM, we talk all the time about adding friction to the money laundering process to make it harder to sort of, execute that, which ultimately should disparage at least some of the criminal activity to begin with. One thing you do really well, I think, to make this point, again, like I've thought about money laundering most of my career, but it's like I love when you get a new perspective on it. And reading the first chapter, the preface into the first chapter on Pablo Escobar of the book, it's this idea where you're having just piles of cash. And like, what the hell am I supposed to do with this? And that's really the birth of money laundering. And now, and we can get into crypto in a minute, but like crypto is the same problem, except you're on blockchains essentially. But talk me through that a little bit.
Well, no, it's interesting. The major problem with cash is brilliant because it's anonymous, which is great. The problem is it's bulky and it's suspicious. In fact, there's a whole bunch of problems with cash for criminals. So you talked briefly about Pablo Escobar there. Pablo Escobar's problem, or one of his problems, was that what made cocaine brilliant for him as a product was it's packageable, it's small, smuggleable across the borders. But the problem is he was selling it for cash, which is bulky. For every one plane of coke he sent north to America to sell, he had to smuggle back 2 planes of cash. So this became a huge issue, how you actually handle all of this cash. And it's an issue for lots of types of crime gangs, cartel drug dealing, prostitution rings, people smugglers. A lot of it's cash business. So firstly, it's bulky. Secondly, it's suspicious. Cash is innately suspicious if you have too much of it. The police pull you over and you've got £100,000 in your car. They have the right to ask you where you got it. That is a legitimate line of inquiry. It's obviously stealable, so a rival crime gang can come along and nick your cash. And also, and this doesn't get thought about a lot, it's subject to inflation. Obviously, inflation is a phenomenon in society. So again, your cash is worth less the more you sort of hang on to it. So for all of these reasons, you need to get rid of cash. You need to put it into some kind of financial system. And obviously, going to the bank with a suitcase full of used £10 or $10 notes is, again, innately suspicious. So that's the birth of money laundering, was sort of, how do I take what is ultimately what I wanted, which was cash, which is anonymous, but make it more solid and more usable by putting it into the financial system. That's almost step one in your kind of money laundering journey.
And I think what the book really does is sort of tells that story. First it was cash, and as we move more and more into a digital world, you're running into a lot of the same problems. I mean, right? It's the same issue in crypto today. One story that I love in the book is in the Din sister case that you dedicate a chapter of the book to. Would you talk us through that case? Because I think it's one of the most interesting.
Well, I was looking for a place to start the book. I mean, the opening chapter is about Pablo Escobar, which I thought was a good idea to start with. Lots of people have seen Narcos. The cocaine cowboys era was sort of the birth of modern money laundering. But I wanted to sort of open up with a case that looked at that kind of cartel drug dealing, big drug dealing, but looked at the move into cryptocurrency, which a lot of these groups have done.
So yeah, it's interesting that you focused on the sort of all the other things that were used for money laundering, all the other goods, luxury goods, cars, putting money into the store likely, as opposed to the crypto, because it did feel to me like this was a really interesting transition case where crypto is like a small part of a much larger sort of laundering scheme. Was that one of your takeaways as well?
Yes, they definitely weren't, that particular gang were not laundering everything through crypto. But what was interesting was, speaking to the police about this, there was a famous sort of encrypted phone service called EncroChat, which was a service used by lots of criminals. Encrypted phones kind of targeted almost at criminals. And when they started, the service was famously hacked by the Dutch and French law enforcement. And when they started interpreting those messages and decoding those messages between criminals, they discovered a lot of traffic about cryptocurrency payments. And I think that was a big eye-opener actually for law enforcement, particularly certainly in Europe.
I think one of the most interesting stories in the book, and I love the way you sort of transition from the Pablo Escobar, like the piles of cash, to the Din sister case where crypto meets cash, meets luxury goods. Would you talk us through these characters?
Yeah, so on the surface, the Din sisters were a couple of middle-aged, quite glam sisters working in the north of England, in Manchester. And they ran a beauty business. They ran an online beauty store where you could order all sorts of unguents to put on your face and eyelash curlers, eyebrow curlers and stuff like that. Not eyebrow curlers. You can tell I don't really work in the beauty business.
Me neither.
But by night, they were drug dealers. They were actually smuggling in heroin and selling it on the streets of northern England. They had a whole network of couriers who were doing this. And to go back to that point about currency and hard cash being suspicious, the police kept stopping the couriers. So the Din sisters hit on a scheme to, instead of using cash, they would swap the money into Bitcoin. Now, that makes a lot of sense because if you think about it, they've got to get the drugs from somewhere. We think it was Pakistan. If you're earning cash in the UK, you've got to somehow bundle up that cash, take it to some money broker who's going to send it across to Pakistan. When it arrives in Pakistan, the cash there, is that going to be secure? How's that all working? Whereas if you look at Bitcoin, if you can change your money to Bitcoin, it's outside the traditional banking system. So there's no suspicious questions, awkward questions being asked. It's instantly transferable to whichever wallet you want in the world, anywhere in the world. But the best thing, I think, for the drug dealers for this was when the investigation was done afterwards, it was discovered that they were paying something like 4% fee for this service. Now, anyone who knows anything about money laundering knows that's an absolute steal. You'd normally pay 20%, as much as 60% for those services. And that translates into tens of thousands of pounds more profit for the drug gang, which, of course, they can spend on more drugs. But what's an interesting postscript to this is when the Din sisters were convicted, they got about 10 years each, the Din sisters. The police seized all sorts of stuff. There's an amazing list of everything they seized, Mercedes cars and Rolex watches and a whole wardrobe of designer labels What they didn't seize was cryptocurrency, because the police, frankly, had their hands full with everything else, weren't able to recover the crypto. So the money that the gang made in crypto, potentially when they get out of prison in whatever is 5-6 years time, depending on how long they serve of their whole sentence, they can actually potentially pick up the crypto that they earned, and it might even be worth more depending on how Bitcoin's price goes in the future. So again, in terms of that long-term planning as money laundering, that makes a lot of sense. You're putting your money somewhere where potentially you're going to make a long-term return. And if you do jail time, you can come out and get your money back.
It's interesting. One chapter that really hit home for me, I was a federal prosecutor for many years, focused on human trafficking and child exploitation and those types of cases. And I will tell you that almost every one of them had Backpage.com in those cases at the time. I then went to do a short detail for about 6 months in the US Senate when I was at DOJ. And I was on the permanent subcommittee for investigations, which did a lengthy report on Backpage.com and the way it was being used, particularly tying Village Voice and a lot of things you actually do in the book really well. But talk to me about what you learned in your research around Backpage and that whole story.
So Backpage surfed this very fine line between advertising prostitution and advertising sexual services. Now, the other problem with that was some of the services being advertised there quite clearly to investigators involve children who obviously can't consent to sex. So they are being trafficked. That is sexual abuse of children. And so the whole slew of cases went against Backpage to try and get them to stop these services being advertised. Backpage fought back using Section 230, which is a law which allows internet companies to effectively publish first and kind of ask questions later. Now, a lot of the time that works in our favor. We're able to publish stuff on Facebook and not have to join a queue of people, getting our stuff vetted before we post it. The downside, of course, is often harmful material will be posted online and we only get to ask questions about it later once it's been posted online. That's exactly what Backpage did. Now, what was interesting, the money laundering angle was as Backpage started to be discovered and sniffed around by people like yourself and other people at the subcommittee and the Department of Justice, this became a big issue because they were making money from these adverts and they wanted to hide that money and particularly hide it from the credit card companies, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, who increasingly were saying, we don't want to touch this money. You may have a legal defense, but we just don't like it. And so Backpage used a lot of financial chicanery to launder and wash their money. And that's what eventually got them. Only in the past few months, actually, we've had the conclusion of the final legal case against Backpage. The site was shut down, and this final legal case against one of the founders was found guilty on money laundering. The only charge they found him guilty on was money laundering. All the other charges, enabling prostitution and so on, all of them dropped. All of them didn't go. Money laundering was what they got the person on in the end. And I find that super fascinating. Again, it's money laundering. If you can crack down on the laundering, you can prosecute, you can get people, and you can stop them doing the crimes.
How did you feel piecing that together?
Honestly, it was really difficult. So the first book I wrote, I mentioned, is called Crime.com, and that's pretty much chronological. It starts certainly in the 1970s, the birth of computers, really, the birth of modern computing and the birth of computer hacking at the same time, which at that point wasn't really a crime because there was no money to steal, really. It was a sort of fun exercise, a kind of intellectual exercise. And so you have this chronological narrative. Lazarus Heist, again, is mainly chronological. We start really with the Sony hack of 2014. That's the sort of big launch pad for the Lazarus Group. And we go all the way through. And obviously the story is, as you know, is still going on. And there's cases we can talk about. They're in the book, Rinsed, Tornado Cash, the amazing laundering of $625 million. Rinsed isn't like that, doesn't have that chronological narrative. And so trying to work out how to piece together a book about money laundering where you don't have a chronology to fall back on, you don't have a narrative arc, is quite difficult. What I ended up doing was using the 3 stages of money laundering. There's sort of 3 classic stages of money laundering. There's placement, where you put your money into a financial system. There's layering, where you mix it around. And there's integration, where you finally get to sort of spend it and enjoy your ill-gotten gains. And so I used that as the pattern. I was like, okay, we're going to look at each of those stages, and we're going to look at how technology has changed each of those stages. And then in the final chapters, we'll look at how it all ties together with this amazing North Korean example, the $625 million theft.
Teach us Money Laundering 101 through the stories that you tell in Rinsed.
Well, I mean, placement, going back to the Din sisters example, for them, placing this money, this tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of pounds of cash from the heroin dealing they were doing, placing that into a bank was a non-starter, was never going to happen. Placing it into a money broker who could send it to Pakistan or wherever, okay, but risky. there's another financial system, has a whole new financial system of cryptocurrency. Placing it into that financial system, well, that's as simple as finding someone who'll turn a blind eye to where the money came from, of whom there are quite a lot, apparently. So again, that sort of placement side, technology is starting to really kind of pick up on that. Layering is the stage where you mix the money around. You move it from place to place, account to account, to try and throw the investigators off the scent. Because the problem is, even if you place the money into the bank and you convince a bank or a crypto firm to take the money, if you're then found out, if you're subsequently discovered to have committed the crime, they can trace the money to the bank and seize it. So putting it to the bank is not enough. You need to take it from the bank, put it into another bank, and maybe turn it to crypto and change it into gold and back into cash. That's the layering stage. And then the final stage is integration, where you cleaned your cash, you then take it and spend it. And as I say, they're not spending it necessarily on prostitutes and cocaine, that they'll often be spending it on property. They'll be spending it on art, on valuable assets that will increase in value and be there when they get out of prison, if they go to prison. And again, in each of those stages being influenced by technology, the layering stage, you've talked briefly there about Helix, which is a crypto mixer, which takes crypto and mixes it around with other people's crypto. That's layering. That can be used for layering. In fact, Helix was entirely about that.
Helix is an interesting one because it was clearly advertising on a darknet market saying, hey, if you've stolen funds or you have illicit drug proceeds, we're your service. And that's essentially what they were prosecuted for. Ultimately, money laundering conspiracy. Larry Harmon was the administrator. He pled guilty and has gone to jail subsequently. But you also write, and there's a full chapter dedicated to Tornado Cash, which is sort of different. Talk me through sort of like why Tornado Cash was interesting to you. I think it's been interesting to you. How do you use it in the book to continue this narrative?
And it's interesting. I was looking in the book for the payoff chapter, that you're working up to something and you're trying to push the readers through and say, we're going somewhere with this. This is going to end up somewhere really, really quite stunning. And so you're looking for that showstopper. And Tornado Cash is it. It's almost like it's the kaleidoscopic case that involves every aspect that I wanted to pick out from the book, including North Korea. The story goes that North Korea, it's alleged, broke into a video game called Axie Infinity. It's a hugely lucrative and popular video game. And it's a phishing email they sent. It was actually a job offer to one of the employees, which is just an amazing way of managing to phish somebody. They managed to get into the company, break in digitally to the company. They realized that the entire game was built on crypto assets. So you play these little characters called Axies based on axolotl salamanders. And you could actually buy and sell your team of Axies, and you could buy and sell the plots of land in the game. Everything was for sale. The whole game was basically effectively a marketplace. But all those things you were buying and selling were actually, in the end, ultimately crypto assets that were moved around on a blockchain within Axie Infinity. So if I sell my team to you, Ari, you'd be buying my team, but actually a crypto asset would be moving on the blockchain from me to you, from my wallet to your wallet. The North Koreans realized this and realized that if they could work out how to steal all that money, there was a huge amount of money there to be stolen. There was a blockchain inside the game, inside Axie Infinity, tracking the players' deals, effectively, their trades. But the whole thing was funded through Ether cryptocurrency, which is tracked on the Ethereum blockchain, an external blockchain. In order to make the two ledgers match up effectively, Axie Infinity invented a thing called the Ronin Bridge, which, as the name suggests, was a bridge between the external ledger and the internal ledger. And the hackers realized if they could take over the bridge, they could steal the money, which is what they did. The bridge, in effect, it was 9 computers around the world that validated all the transactions and matched up the ledgers. And most importantly, if the ledgers didn't match, they would move assets from the internal blockchain, the external blockchain, to level everything up. The hackers broke into the game. They managed to find their way to the bridge. They managed to take over the bridge, and they stole what was worth at the time $625 million. Now, I've been slightly circumspect in the book about this, but I'm more bold in podcasts like this one. That's the biggest theft of all time. The problem then, of course, for the North Koreans is you've got $500 million of hot crypto. Where do you go with it? Again, it's that thing of, you can't go to the bank with a suitcase of money. So that's what led them to Tornado Cash, which is a mixer like Helix. It mixes crypto around. But what's interesting about Tornado Cash that's slightly different to Helix is it was set up as what's called a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization. So the idea was users of Tornado Cash would control the service. The guys who built it at one stage just destroyed their passwords and said, that's it, we don't run it anymore. If you interact with Tornado Cash, if you use it, you're given a voting token, and you can use those voting tokens to make changes to the service. So effectively, we're taking our hands off the rudder, and it's now over to the users to run this thing. And it's done using smart contracts. So these are effectively pieces of code, pieces of software that you can use to dictate what happens to your money. So this whole thing, Tornado Cash, was this kind of, well, supposedly a rudderless, leaderless, captainless boat on the high seas of crypto. And so the North Koreans apparently dropped $455 million of crypto into Tornado Cash, which did exactly what it was programmed to do. Rinsed it around, washed it around, spat it out to a new wallet address. Maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Harry, but as far as we're aware, we don't know now where that money is. It has been laundered. It has gone, potentially into the coffers of the North Korean government.
It's interesting, and then obviously it becomes what we do play a lot the role in is that cat and mouse game that occurs throughout that process, right? We have the ability to trace through many mixers today, but can that illicit actor, can North Korea get to an off ramp, right, to convert those funds to more usable currencies before law enforcement using tools can get there? And that's really become the issue. I will say that we'll see funds from a hack that happened years ago, the Harmony Bridge hack, for example. We'll still see funds from those hacks being laundered today. I think because of this cash issue that you identify in the Pablo Escobar chapter, and that is the more money you steal, the harder it is to launder. That's true in crypto as well, right? It's easy to move smaller amounts of funds without being identified, much harder to move larger amounts of funds. We talked about the Bitfinex hack. That was the fatal flaw, really, at the end of the day for those hackers.
It's interesting. In a way, cryptocurrency has solved a lot of challenges of laundering, but created a whole bunch of new challenges. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that you can't eat crypto. At some stage, you have to change the crypto into some usable thing. For North Korea, it might be missile parts or nuclear weapons. For drug dealers, it might be a yacht somewhere or a Lamborghini. You can't, in most cases, in the vast majority of cases, buy those things just with outright crypto. So you have to, at some stage, you say off-ramp your crypto into fiat currency or get it into some financial system out the other side, some fiat-based dollar or pound or yen-based system. And actually, we may have talked about this, but the Axie Infinity job is the high point, I think, of North Korean crypto hacking so far. And there's been a bit of a slowdown subsequently. And one of the theories behind that is possibly that glut of money that they're trying to now launder, it's taking so much time to sort of percolate through that it's caused a backlog effect. It's a jam, which again goes back to that point of if you cut the laundering, you cut the crime. If that is true, it seems that because of the difficulties of laundering all that money, the other crimes have been slowed down because there's now a sort of queue, effectively, money moving through. I don't know whether that's the case. It sort of logically makes sense.
It does. I get asked this question all the time around, have Tornado Cash, Sinbad, other types of mixing services that have been sanctioned or actions have been against these services. I get asked all the time, do I believe that those have had an impact? Is this helping? How do we measure that? And my usual answer is something around, look, I think we're seeing significant friction added to the laundering process, right? We're making it harder and harder. They're still going to have success with the exploits and the laundering the funds. But if we can sort of add some friction there, and I think sanctions, I think enforcement actions have had some impact. But this is a very, very determined group of very sophisticated actors. What for you was the most interesting part of writing this book?
I think for me, it was, there's a couple of chapters in the book about a crime group called the Black Axe, which originates in West Africa, particularly Nigeria, during the 1970s. It's an amazing sort of backstory where it starts out as a political emancipation movement, really, and then morphs into this horrific crime gang. Most of the crimes that the Black Axe carry out, people will have heard of. They are behind a lot of the romance fraud that goes on, where people get seduced online and then tricked into parting with money. The sort of modern twist on that, where there's cryptocurrency scams involved. Business email compromise, where business will get an email from their supplier saying, hey, we've changed our bank account. Please pay our new bank account. And then the email comes from the hackers, and the new bank account is the hacker's bank account. Cartel drug dealing, again, people trafficking, prostitution, forced labor. Black Axe is involved in all of it. They're an astonishing, what I call a polymorphic criminal enterprise. And again, coming back to the money laundering point, they're the interflow of money laundering. If you steal money from a victim in Germany and you want to launder it and exit it in Hong Kong, there'll be Black Axe operatives who'll help you. They're bound together by sort of close bonds, effectively, through this movement that they've all joined. I'd heard, I think, a bit of Black Axe, but just had no idea of the scale of this thing. And the book just scrapes the surface of it. I just look at the money laundering side, but it's an absolutely astonishing sort of group of people. And the methodologies behind it are sort of endlessly fascinating. And I find that interesting because it's almost like wherever the Black Axe puts down roots, it takes on a different type of criminality. So depending on where they are in the world, they will sort of commit a different type of crime.
I will tell folks, we're going to drop this podcast as soon as August 13th comes around. So folks don't have to do what I do and can buy an actual copy of Rinsed, not
Fantastic.
something, that I got in a FedEx from India. Geoff, thank you so much for joining us. It's kind of crazy when I think about it. I've literally spent the last, 15 or more years of my life thinking about money laundering. And when I can visualize it in like new ways or visualize these types of typologies that we talk about every day, it's like you feel like it's a gift. Geoff's book and then this conversation really does that, right? This idea where money laundering at its heart it's to solve a problem. And that is you're dealing with piles of cash and overwhelmed by the volume. His story about Pablo Escobar, needing 2 planes back for every 1 plane of Coke for the cash, really, I think, speaks to the issue. And what the book really does so well is tells that story of money laundering from those kind of early days of cash, bulk cash smuggling, to kind of what we have today, which is sophisticated money laundering in the crypto space. And he talks about where, crypto in some respects makes money laundering easier, right? We can move faster with larger amounts of funds faster than ever before, but we can now track and trace those funds. So I love the way, my favorite part of the conversation was when he breaks down the different pieces of money laundering, from placement to layering, ultimately to integration, and really kind of tells that story with what he calls the showstopper, North Korea's hack of the Ronin Bridge, where they stole $625 million and laundered much of that through Tornado Cash. So it is this ability, I think, that Geoff really has, and we saw this in Lazarus Heist, both the book and the podcast, to tell really complicated stories about money laundering and financial crime and cybercrime in a way that there are characters. And we got into those characters in the book today, the Din sisters and Hush Puppy and Big Boss and Coin Ninja and Helix and Larry Harmon. I mean, just even actually summarizing this right now, I'm like, wow, we talked about a lot of stuff today. So it's really extraordinary to tell stories that I think really hammer home the point about money laundering. Next on TRM Talks, I sit down with TaxBit's Europe lead, Max Berndt, for what I promise will be the liveliest discussion of crypto and tax you have ever heard. If you love the show, leave a review wherever you're listening to it. Follow us on LinkedIn to subscribe to our newsletter, The Weekly Roundup, to get the latest news on crypto regulation, compliance, and investigations.
TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. This episode was produced in partnership with Voltage Productions. The music for this show was provided by Helix.
Now, let's get back to building.